Hello, this is BENTVNEWS Roundup, a compilation of major stories in the weekend. I'm Tunde Alabi. Thank you for being part of the program today. Labour leader Jeremy Corbyn has accused the government of either being negligent in his role as one of the big customers of Carillion, or it was merely giving the bust company public money to keep it afloat, which has now failed. Reacting to the accusation, the Prime Minister, Theresa May, stated that the official receiver of the now liquidated Carillion should fast-track its investigation into the business dealings of the company and the activities and conduct of its past and current directors.
In the last 6 months, the government has awarded more than £2 billion worth of contracts to Carillion. It did so even after the share price was in free fall and the company had issued profit warnings. Why did the government do that?
It might be helpful if I just set out for the right honourable gentleman that a company's profit warning means that it believes it will not make as much profit as it had expected to make. If the government did, if it was the case that the government pulled out of contracts, or indeed private sector companies pulled out of contracts whenever a profit warning was issued, that would be the best way to ensure that companies failed and jobs were lost. It would also, for the government, raise real issues about providing continuing uninterrupted public services. Yes, we did, but we did recognise that it was a severe profit warning. And that's why we took action in relation to the contracts that we issued, and we ensured that all but one of those contracts was a joint venture. What does that mean? It means that there is another company available to step in and take over the contract. But I say to the right honourable gentleman, this wasn't just an issue of the government issuing contracts. Actually, we see that the Labour-run Welsh government issued a contract after the profit warning last July, and only last week, in the public sector, a public sector body announced that Carillion was their preferred bidder. Only last week. Was that the government? No, it was Labour-run Leeds City Council.
Mr. Speaker, for the record, Leeds have not signed a contract with Carillion. It's the government who've been handing out contracts. It's the government's responsibility to ensure Carillion is properly managed. Between July, Mr. Speaker, between July and the end of last year, the share price of Carillion fell by 90%. 3 profit warnings were issued. Unbelievably, some contracts were awarded by the government even after the 3rd profit warning. Mr. Speaker, it looks like the government was handing Carillion public contracts either to keep the company afloat, which clearly hasn't worked, or it was just deeply negligent of the crisis that was coming down the line.
Mr. Speaker, I'm very happy to answer questions when the right honourable gentleman asks one. He didn't.
Mr. Speaker, I asked the government if they'd been negligent or not, and they clearly have been very negligent. Tory MPs might shout, Mr. Speaker, but the reality is, as of today, over 20,000 Carillion workers are very worried about their future, and for many of them, the only recourse tonight is to phone a DWP hotline. The frailties were well known. Hedge funds were betting against Carillion since 2015. RBS Bank, state-owned, making provision against Carillion last year. The government is supposed to protect protect public money through Crown representatives who are supposed to monitor these powerful corporations who get huge public contracts. So why, and this is a question that the Prime Minister needs to answer, and the question is this: why did the position of Crown representative to Carillion remain vacant during the crucial period of August to November, when the profit warnings were being issued, the share price was in free fall, and many people were very worried?
I'm afraid I have to say to the right honourable gentleman, of course, a Crown... Can I say to the Shadow Foreign Secretary, I will indeed answer the question, but I know that she herself has praised Carillion in the past for the work that they've done. So, can I say to the right honourable gentleman, yes, I mean, there is obviously now a Crown representative who's been fully involved in the government's response before the appointment of the Crown representative to replace the one that had previously been in place. The government chief commercial officer and the Cabinet Office Director of Markets and Suppliers took over those responsibilities. So it was not the case that there was nobody from the government who was looking at these issues. That's a standard procedure. It ensured that there was oversight of Carillion's contracts with the government during the appointment process of the Crown representative.
Well, they clearly weren't looking very well. Carillion went into liquidation with debts we now understand to be £1.29 billion, a pension deficit of £600 million, and at the same time, this company was paying out ever-increasing shareholder dividends, wildly excessive bonuses to directors, and today, 8,000 Carillion workers on private sector contracts will no longer be paid. The chief executive is going to be paid, however, for another 10 months. One rule for the super rich, another for everybody else. Can the Prime Minister assure the House today that not a single penny more will go to the chief executive or the directors of this company?
Can I first say to the right honourable gentleman that obviously this is a situation that is changing as decisions are being taken, but my understanding is that, that there are a number of private sector contractors who have now come to an agreement, and for the facilities management contractors who have come to an agreement with the official receiver that means that their workers will indeed continue to be paid. I think it's important that we say that that is the official receiver is doing their job and working with those companies. He's raised the issue of bonuses, and of course, people are concerned about this issue and and are rightly asking questions about it. That's why we're making sure that the official receiver's investigation into the business dealings of the company is fast-tracked, that it looks into the conduct not just of current directors, but also of previous directors and their actions, and the official receiver does have the powers to ensure that in reviewing payments to executives, where those payments are unlawful or unjustified, he can take action to recover those payments. It's important that the official receiver is able to do their job. It's also important. Government's job is to ensure that public services continue to be provided, and that's what we're doing. The right honourable gentleman said earlier in one of his questions it was the government's job to ensure that Carillion was properly managed. We were a customer of Carillion, not the manager of Carillion, and that's a very important difference. And it is also important, that we have protected taxpayers from an unacceptable bailout of a private company.
Mr. Speaker, when Carillion went into liquidation, many contractors were still unpaid. This company, Carillion, were notorious late payers, taking 120 days to pay, placing a huge burden on small companies, 4 times longer than the 30 days in the prompt payment code that Carillion had indeed themselves signed up to. So why did the government allow a major government contractor to get away with this? Will she commit to Labour's policy that abiding by the prompt payment code should be a basic requirement for all future government contracts?
Yes, we of course we look at the behaviour of companies that we contract with in relation to payments. This question of prompt payments has been one that has been brought up in this House, I have to say, for as long as I have been in this House, and efforts and work is always being done on it. But the Right Honourable Gentleman has raised an important point about the impact of Carillion's liquidation on small companies. That's why this morning the Business Secretary and the City Minister held a roundtable with the banks to discuss credit lines to small and medium-sized enterprises and to make clear that SMEs are not responsible for the collapse of Carillion. The Business Secretary has also held further roundtables today with representatives of small businesses, construction trade associations and trade unions, workers' unions, to make sure that we're on top of the potential effects on the wider supply chain. It is right that we look at those very carefully, that we take this action, and it's also right that we do put in place, through the DWP, support for any workers who do find themselves no longer employed as a result of this.
Corbyn. It's a bit late for one subcontractor. Floratech, owed $800,000 by Carillion, have already had to make some of their staff redundant because of the collapse.
Experts have accused US President Donald Trump of encouraging tyrant leaders around the world to clamp down on press freedom. They claim Trump's continuous attack on influential media institutions in the U.S. has spreading fake news, has emboldened dictatorial government against the press.
If you want to discover the source of the division in our country, look no further than the fake news and the crooked media, which would rather get ratings and clicks than tell the truth.
President Trump often hits back at coverage he doesn't like. He's used the term fake news in no fewer than 180 tweets since Inauguration Day, as well as in countless speeches, interviews, and comments. Press freedom activists say Trump's strategy is having an effect.
I mean, he's very eager to have Twitter, mainstream news organizations pick up his tweets and write about them and amplify them. So he is, in one regard, pretty sophisticated about this, in that he is he's using the very press that he is denigrating and is very sensitive to, and gets quickly irritated by anything he sees in the press that he's already decried as fake.
This is an apple.
Stung by the attacks on their integrity, major media outlets have come up with new slogans and ad campaigns like CNN's Apple to defend themselves. Press watchdog groups say authoritarian leaders are following Trump's lead.
We saw the term fake news being used in the Philippines, in Russia, in China, in Egypt, to justify their own repression of the media, their own attempts to delegitimize journalists. So we've also seen China saying, hey, the U.S. is finally waking up to what we've been saying this whole time about, the media being problematic. And that's not what we want to see around the world.
China's top cybersecurity official recently cited fake news to defend against a report ranking China last in the world in internet freedom.
Even countries like the United States and Europe, everyone's discussing it together, like with these new media, these fake news, rumors, this kind of raging problem. How should we deal with this? We are all facing this together.
The phenomenon is spreading. Syria's President Bashar al-Assad dismissed human rights reports about deaths in military prisons by saying, "We live in a fake news era." Authoritarian leaders from Thailand's Prayut Chan-o-cha to Cambodia's Hun Sen and Malaysia's Najib Razak have talked about fake news. Singapore is said to be considering a fake news law in the new year.
That has seemed to embolden those leaders in thinking that what they're doing is acceptable, that they can get away with it, that there won't be chastising on the part of the U.S. government.
Trump has welcomed several authoritarians to the White House. He hailed Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdogan as a friend, despite Turkey's reputation as the world's leading jailer of journalists. The Committee to Protect Journalists says the number of reporters jailed in 2017 hit an all-time high for the second year running.
Also, some of the senators in the president's party have expressed similar concerns about President Trump's persistent attack on the press. Republican Senator Jeff Flake has accused the president of utterances similar to that of Stalin.
The two Republican senators from the state of Arizona, both who are not running for re-election, are taking to task the president for his attacks on the media. John McCain in a Washington Post opinion piece and Jeff Flake on the floor of the Senate say Donald Trump's words are being used by foreign leaders to silence and shutter one of democracy's key pillars.
It is a testament to the condition of our democracy that our own president uses words infamously spoken by Joseph Stalin to describe his enemies. It bears noting that so fraught with malice was the phrase enemy of the people that even Nikita Khrushchev forbade its use, telling the Soviet Communist Party that the phrase had been introduced by Stalin for the purpose of, quote, annihilating such individuals, unquote, who disagreed with the supreme leader.
The White House fired back at Flake, saying the senator served as a mouthpiece for Cuba's oppressive government during a recent trip there.
He's not criticizing the president because he's against oppression. He's criticizing the president because he has terrible poll numbers.
A veteran political analyst says there are more senators who share similar concerns.
A lot of his colleagues, particularly Republican colleagues, who may be inclined to agree with his general point, if not the exact usage of the phrase enemy of the people, they can't say things like this because they intend to run for re-election. And they don't want to be they don't want to be critical of their own party's president.
For President Trump, however, attacking the press is a proven winner. It was part of his campaign, undermining traditional institutions that propelled him to victory.
This president doesn't see the press as a legitimate institution. He calls fake news anything he doesn't agree with, anything that doesn't support his position.
U.S. officials have expressed concerns over growing extremism in Africa due to unemployment, poverty, and lack of opportunities. U.S. security intelligence is worried that ISIS could seize on the opportunities to create the next terror hub.
Poverty, political disillusionment, and masses of young, unemployed Muslims. Those are ideal conditions for Islamic extremism, and they are all found in Africa.
If we're trying to look in the future, it's actually happening now that Africa is going to be the spot. It's going to be the hot spot.
The entire African continent has less than half the number of American troops deployed in Afghanistan. But increases in terrorist activity are among the reasons why the American military presence has grown rapidly on the continent, from 3,200 military personnel in 2009 to about 6,500 today.
There is African concern that the U.S. approach is becoming rather more militarized or more concerned with military and security issues than had been the case in the past.
John Campbell, who served as ambassador to Nigeria under President George W. Bush, told VOA the main thrust of effort on the continent should be on what he calls the root causes of extremism: lack of economic development and poor governance. But this effort will likely prove more difficult if the State Department's budget is slashed by a third, as forecast in the administration's budget plan.
Is, in fact, a security approach going to work? And I would suggest that by and large, no.
U.S. Africa Command, which oversees military activities on the continent, aims to strengthen local African militaries to combat Islamic extremists.
Fire when ready!
Africa's growing young male population is ripe for recruitment. Africa Command's senior enlisted leader told VOA.
You have no options, and here comes an extremist that is offering you a motorbike and a bride. What do you think you're going to do? Your family's starving, you can't provide for them, and somebody's giving you an option.
The administration this year expanded the authority to strike al-Shabaab and Islamic State fighters in Somalia, allowing offensive strikes against the militants, rather than just strikes defending African allies and their American advisors.
It definitely helps, because we're doing our best to go ahead and employ our assets to help them out in any way we can.
But the war against extremism in Africa has not come without a cost. A U.S. Navy SEAL died aiding Somali security forces against al-Shabaab in May, and 4 American soldiers were killed in an October Islamic State ambush in Niger. If the security needs grow in coming months, more American troops could find themselves facing dangerous situations across the African continent.
African Union Ambassador to the United States, Africana Chimbobori, has said President Trump's derogatory remarks about African countries will make strengthening relationships between the U.S. and African states very difficult.
Amid an ongoing backlash at home and abroad to remarks multiple sources say the president made about what kind of immigrants he would prefer, the president was asked by a reporter if he wants more immigrants from Norway.
I want them coming from everywhere.
Thanks, everyone. Jim, thank you.
White House Press Secretary Sarah Huckabee Sanders acknowledged that the president used tough language during his meeting with lawmakers about an immigration deal and said that is part of his appeal.
I think that's one of the reasons the American people love him. One of the reasons that he won and is sitting in the Oval Office today is because he isn't a scripted robot. He's somebody who tells things like they are sometimes, and sometimes he does use tough language.
In the aftermath of the remarks, Botswana, Ghana, Haiti, Namibia, Senegal, and the African Union have lodged formal diplomatic protest. The African Union ambassador to the United States, Arikana Chihambori Kwa, told VOA negative remarks about Africa and the Trump administration's America First policy are a stumbling block to a traditionally very close relationship between the U.S. and the African continent.
It's a wound that's going to leave a very deep scar. And that's troubling for me in the sense that I'm here to ensure, promote good relationships between the U.S. and Africa. Comments of that nature make it an uphill battle to try and continue to solidify that relationship.
State Department spokesperson Heather Nauert said relations are still strong.
We have a deep respect for people from the African continent. We have strong partnerships with the nearly 50 countries on the African continent. I will say this, which I say about other countries as well, our relationships with countries are deeper than any one alleged comment.
Nauert said Secretary of State Tillerson looks forward to traveling to Africa early this year. Ambassador Chihambori Kwa said Tillerson will be welcomed with open arms.
South Africa's Cape Town could run out of water by April following severe drought in the city, which is its worst in a century.
Cape Town, which attracts about 2 million tourists a year, is facing its biggest water crisis ever. Mayor Patricia de Lille warned of a dire situation as drilling into one of the major aquifers under the city began last week.
We're losing 1% of our dams, 1.5 every week. Our dams for the first time is below 30%, and I'm really worried.
Residents will have to queue for water when water levels in the dams get too low. At a trial water collection site, people fill up their water bottles but are limited to a maximum 25 liters per person per day.
While we are working as hard as we can to bring additional water on board, Cape Townians must help us to save water.
Something some residents are taking seriously as the so-called Day Zero in April approaches.
We definitely have to do our part and use as little water as possible. But I do hope that the government is doing something to prevent Day Zero, because it will be a national crisis. It will be honestly horrific.
We can't bath anymore. We must just shower, and every other day we shower to save water. But we make do.
But one businessman wishes there were alternatives other than having to switch off all the taps and close his hotel when the city runs out of water.
There are countries in this world that have proven that there are ways to deal with
with drought and with desert regions. One has to look at the Middle East and see what Israel did to a desert there in respect of desalinization. And I know India are also doing a lot of good work with desalinization.
Cape Town is one of South Africa's hottest tourist destination. About 9% of the country's $33 billion economic output last year came from the tourism industry, according to the World Travel and Tourism Council.
And with that report, we conclude the news roundup for this week. Thank you for being part of the program. I'm Tunde Alabi. Enjoy the rest of your week. Bye. Regardless, resident status abroad, living outside the shores of one's homeland can really be challenging and sometimes very difficult. Let's be sincere, to keep pace with happenings from the host country abroad can really be difficult. Here on Dialogue in Diaspora, we give you every information, every news, every current issue you need to know on happenings outside the UK. Dialogue in Diaspora is your link between the world and the United Kingdom. It's your window to Africa development. Here, live on BEN Television.